Thank you so much for the introduction, and to everyone for being here this morning, and for the museum team for having me. I'm excited to be here, not least because in my home city in Chicago, I got a text from my wife this morning saying it is 5 degrees and snowing. So it is very nice to be in Los Angeles for all sorts of reasons. I'm going to talk to you about my book, Resisting Nazism. It's going to be kind of a whistle-stop tour of the book. But I also want to tell the story behind the book and share a few tales of the unexpected along the way. So this is a story that begins with the ninth candle. We work with schools all across the US to try and improve Holocaust education, and we do that through programs for students and professional development for their teachers. And right from the beginning, what we wanted to do was champion what I call inquiry-based learning, right? The idea is to help students to analyze historical documents and to draw some kind of meaningful conclusion from their analysis that helps them to understand something about why and how the Holocaust happened in the time and place that it did. It seems to me, even now, that too much Holocaust education in the US sets out to get an emotional response from students, and there's a kind of faulty logic at the heart of that goal, which is that if they have an emotional response to the material, then it proves that they've understood something about the wrongs of discrimination. And therefore, when they have an emotional response, it's kind of taken as proof of this premise, the proof of the premise had already been proven, right? So it's this kind of odd circular reasoning, and it drives teachers to search out material that is most likely to get the emotional response that is desired, and that leads them to highly emotive material, which could be fiction like The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, for example. That's one that I come across in classrooms very often, and so the student has the response, the desired response, and that's taken as proof, but of course, they've not necessarily understood anything from reading this book. So the ninth candle set out to address this issue. And aside from anything else, that kind of circular reasoning where you're pulling on the highly emotive material, it leads to the repetitive presentation of Jews on the one hand as these kind of witless victims who are always falling always falling toward their own doom, and of the Nazis as these kind of brutal anti-heroes almost, who are super organized and very ruthless. And of course, those are misconceptions that have no bearing on reality. So our program set out to challenge all of that. And as we did more and more of them, I found that students and teachers alike were both asking the same question over and over, which is, why didn't more people resist Nazism, right? They're being shown this material that's highly repetitive, and then they have this question afterwards, why did no one do anything to resist this? And of course, the answer to that question is that actually there are plenty of people who resisted Nazism in one form or other. It's just for a variety of complex reasons you may not have heard anything about these people. So in our programming, we began to gather together materials that set out to preempt this question, right? We wanted to teach students and their teachers about people who had done something to challenge Nazism in some way at some point in its existence between 1920 and the present. And after a certain amount of time, I had a stack of these stories about kind of lesser known individuals from history who had done something. And I began to think to myself, this is starting to look a bit like a book. But I needed some kind of theoretical framework to tie it all together. And I found that framework in a book by an historian named Detlev Peukert. And Detlev Peukert's not somebody that I expect everyone to know. He is worthy of a book in his own right. He died in very tragic circumstances when he was only 39 years old in the late 1980s, early 90s. So he's been gone for a long time, and his career was cut very short. But even so, he published some incredible books that are still worth reading today. And yeah, no doubt in my mind, had he lived, he would be probably the biggest historian of this subject right now. But in his book about the Edelweiss pirates, I'm going to talk more about them later on, he set out this theory of resistance in which resistance becomes something that is multi-layered. And so he drew a graph to illustrate his idea. And along the y-axis, he has criticism that is just in private, like your private sphere of influence, and then it goes all the way out to the public sphere of influence, something that's happening out of doors, out of your house. And then on the x-axis, he has general, partial criticism of the system right down at the bottom, going all the way up to overall criticism of the system. So if you're here on the graph and all the way out there, and you've got overall criticism of the system that is being conducted in a very public way, he described that as active political resistance, right? So someone like Oskar Schindler, who openly defied the Nazi regime and risked everything to do so, he's up here. But what Peukert does is explore all of the layers of resistance that are further down on the graph, beginning all the way down here. So even something that's very simple, that's done entirely in private, and that is only a partial criticism of the system, his theory still describes that as resistance. So right at the base of the graph, he begins with non-conformity. And then if that continues and it becomes more public and more general, then you get refusal or non-compliance. And then if you continue along that path, you go up to protest, and then finally, eventually, all the way out to active political resistance. So in the book, what I wanted to do was explore all of those layers of resistance that come before active political resistance. I wanted to get into the stories that are complicated and contradictory, and that don't offer us an easy moral, but rather challenge us to think about resistance and what it is. So that was one of the goals of the book. The other was to treat Nazism as an ideology rather than as a particular period of time. So normally when the students or the teachers are asking the question, why didn't people resist Nazism? What they actually mean is, why didn't people resist during the Third Reich era between 1933 and 45? Now, obviously, that's like an apogee of Nazism. That's when Hitler and his party are in power. But Nazism existed long before then, right? It's born in 1920, and it exists up till the moment that he comes into power. And it continues to exist after 1945 and up to the present. So with these stories, I wanted to challenge the ideology and not just that one particular era. So another thing that I wanted to do in the book as well is augment all of this with interviews. So interviews with eyewitnesses, experts, people who had some special interest in the particular story that was being told. And that, I hope, adds an extra layer to what is there in the book. So the book begins in 1920s Germany. The first chapter is about the people that I believe resisted Nazism in its early stage most consistently, which were the cartoonists who worked for satirical magazines in the Weimar era. So there's really very little resistance to Nazism to speak of in the early 1920s in particular. The reason being is that for a long time, nobody thought that this posed any kind of credible threat to their lives or to society, right? As late as 1928, the Nazis are still winning less than 3% of the general elections. So if they're thought of at all, then they're thought of as this kind of weird fringe novelty act. It's only later on, after the Wall Street crash, that the threat that they pose becomes a lot more real and immediate and obvious. But nevertheless, these cartoonists were trying to draw people's attention to them from the very beginning. And broadly speaking, they go from making fun of Hitler in the early 1920s to kicking him when he's down in the mid-1920s after his failed coup attempt, to issuing then these kind of very macabre direct warnings in the late 1920s and up to 33. One of the cartoons that I discuss in the book is called What Does Hitler Look Like? This is by a Jewish artist, Theodor Thomas Heine, and it's really an extraordinary piece of work. Just the premise, what does Hitler look like to us today, sounds really weird because Hitler is so iconic, right? We think of the side parting and the moustache and the overblown rhetorical poses when he was speaking. And it is therefore very easy to forget that in the early 1920s, at the beginning of his career, Hitler didn't want anyone to know what he looked like. And so there are stories of photographers at meetings of the Nazi Party being beaten up and their cameras taken from them. The reason being that Hitler was trying to cultivate this Messiah-like aura around himself. And he thought that if images that could be reproduced en masse and that could appear in thousands of copies of newspapers were to spring up, then it would detract from that aura that he was trying to build, right? He wanted you to have heard of him. He wanted you to know that he was this kind of transcendentally good public speaker. He didn't want you to know what he looked like because he was worried that would pierce the mystique. So Heine, the artist, takes this and runs with the idea, and he kind of creates a table of possible portraits of Hitler, each one asking something like, is it his eyes that are the main feature? Is it his mouth? Is it his chin? Is it his forehead? Is he large? Is he skinny? All of this kind of stuff. And then when you get to the final cartoon, it's this very abstract drawing with a providential eye in a thundery sky with bolts of lightning and coming down from it, and guns and stars of David, and just a very eerie image. And the caption to the picture says that the question has to go unanswered because Hitler's not a person, he's a phenomenon, and only an abstract artist could draw that phenomenon. So I think the reason that I zoom in on this cartoon in the book is that it was very obvious. It makes it clear that for anyone who was listening and paying attention, even as early as 1923, the specific threat that Hitler posed, that he had a vision for the country that was violent and chaotic and specifically anti-Semitic, that was clear to everybody from the beginning. Another cartoon from much later on that I pick out as by a guy called Karl Holz. It was drawn in 1932, and it pictures Hitler as a butcher. So he's there wearing an apron and he's sharpening his butcher's knife. And on the apron, written in blood, among other things, it says, war with France, war with Russia, war with our neighboring states, heads will roll. And then there are these kind of bloody stars of David and handprints smeared all over the apron. Now, Holtz wasn't making a prediction about what would happen. This is what I mean when I say he was issuing a warning about what could happen. I'm sure that if he'd have been able to look into a crystal ball and see up till 1945, he would have been as horrified as everybody else. But the cartoon's a great example of why and how these artists were engaged in acts of resistance, right? They were trying to warn the public as best they could. I was surprised when I was writing this chapter to find that the artist met a variety of fates after 1933, from being murdered in concentration camps all the way up to becoming complicit with the regime and apologizing for all of their earlier work and going off to work for the Nazis instead. So there are lots of different threads that I try to follow through the fates of these individuals. So that's chapter 1. The second chapter is about a man named Sebastian Haffner. Haffner was a German, not Jewish, a German journalist and writer who became famous in his later life. If you've seen the Netflix documentary, The Meaning of Hitler, which came out, I think, 5 or 6 years ago now, that's based on a book by Haffner of the same title. But in the late 1920s and early 30s, Haffner wasn't a famous guy. He was just another man on the street. And after his death, he died in London in 1999. His son, Oliver, who's one of the people that I interviewed for the book, when we did the interview, Oliver was in his late 80s. He, after his dad had died, went into his dad's office and stuffed at the back of a drawer in his desk found an unpublished manuscript, and it was a memoir his dad had never told him about, from his life in the late 1920s and early 30s, documenting how he fell out of love with his own country and then ended up fleeing to England. When it was published, Oliver saw it through to publication, and there were people in Germany who immediately rejected it and said that this is so prescient, it's so accurate, there is no way that anyone could have been this insightful about Nazism. It has to have been a forgery, right? Your dad, writing in the 1980s or 1990s, came up with this plan that he's going to save his reputation by writing this phony manuscript so that after the war we can all, or after he's gone, we can all think that he never had any doubts from the beginning, right? So it's just an extraordinary story, and because of that, those allegations, which were proven to be completely false, I think even now, 20 years after it was published, 25 years, that book still doesn't have the traction that it deserves, and it's a really unique, one-of-a-kind glimpse of life for those who were not specifically targeted by Hitler, but nevertheless felt oppressed by him in the early 1930s. So yeah, it was, as far as I'm aware, the first time that Oliver had given an interview, certainly such an extensive interview about his dad's book, and it was really an honor to be able to speak with him. It also proves, I think, as well, that the first step toward effective resistance, when you are living in an oppressive society, can be something as simple as writing down your own ideas to interrogate who you are as a citizen, right? That's what Hafner was doing. He was interrogating himself to try and figure out how he could do something against this terrible regime. The third chapter is about a group of German kids called the Edelweiss Pirates. So these were, by and large, working class kids who resisted Nazism by refusing to join the Hitler Youth. So as the 1930s went on, the Hitler Youth became harder and harder to escape until the point that it's made mandatory. But there were nevertheless some teenagers who refused and never joined. And some of them went further than that and engaged in much more active resistance on Peukkert's chart to try and undermine the regime. The regime did everything it could to tarnish these kids. It took them seriously. They ended up on the radar of Heinrich Himmler himself, who's writing about the threat that they pose and that they need to be contained. We know that because all of his orders survived the war. So the Nazis took the threat that the Edelweiss Pirates posed seriously. They tried to tarnish their reputation. They would say these kids are no good, they are petty criminals, they're involved in some kind of underworld, and those allegations and those smears survived the war, and they survived right up to the present. So even now in Germany, there are efforts ongoing to try and rehabilitate the reputations of these kids, because for so long they've been smeared. And I think partly as a result of that, there are some Edelweiss pirates who've written biographies, who've tried to tell their stories. They've never been translated from German into English. And as a result of that, they just kind of haven't made it outside of their own country, which is sad and strange because these stories are really quite inspirational. Okay, Tale of the Unexpected #1. I came across an amazing tale of resistance just a bit too late. Like, I found this out literally just weeks after I'd submitted the final version of the manuscript. In 1938, the synagogue in Nuremberg was pulled down. That was a prelude to Kristallnacht, and because it wasn't part of Kristallnacht, the fate of this synagogue is often kind of completely overlooked, but it really paved the way. It was almost like a testing ground for the Nazis. They wanted to see what would happen when they pulled this thing down, and once they figured they could get away with it, it wasn't long before they unfold this plan on a much larger scale across the rest of the country. So there had been a synagogue in Nuremberg in the Middle Ages, and in there was this decorative stone, a Judenstein, the so-called Jew's stone. It's like a decorative foundation stone The Jewish community in Nuremberg, when they built the new synagogue in the late 19th century, they managed to acquire that stone. They bring it into the new synagogue, and it's there to kind of remind them of the longevity of their community. When the Nazis pull this down, the Judenstein is obviously under threat once again. There's a risk that this antique, which is hundreds of years old and extremely precious, might get destroyed. So just a few weeks after I'd submitted the manuscript for this book, I came across a report of the secret police from Nazi Germany saying that a man named Fritz Fisch, who was a member of the Nazi Party but complaining that he had only joined as recently as 1937, he was an architect who had worked with the Jewish community to save that stone. And the Nazi Party had caught him, they had expelled him, which would have spelled the end of his life and career effectively. And he had been punished publicly. That's all I know about Fritz Fisch. But that stone, against all of the odds, because they hid it, it survived. And when the Nuremberg synagogue was rebuilt for a third time, if you go out to Germany today and visit the Nuremberg synagogue, the new one, you will see that stone. They have it embedded in the wall. And all of that is thanks to this completely unknown man, Fritz Fisch, who worked with the Jewish community despite being a member of the Nazi Party and despite knowing that he would lose everything. So I very much hope that one day I'll be able to find out more about this guy. I hope that there is something out there in the archives that might tell us more about him and who he was and what happened to him. But right now, that's the story of resistance that got away. So the next section of the book deals with the period 1939 to 45. There are obviously lots of spectacular stories of resistance from that period that I could have picked. And in the end, I made the difficult decision not to include the stories of escape from the Chelmno extermination camp, the stories of uprisings in the Treblinka extermination camp and in Auschwitz, and the stories of resistance in all of the various ghettos. I also deliberately omitted Oskar Schindler and Anne Frank because I'm satisfied that these are stories with which we are already familiar. So instead, I zoomed in on one story of German resistance, one story of Jewish resistance, and one story of resistance from the Allied nations. So the fourth chapter is about a man named Kurt Gerstein. Kurt Gerstein was a German, a member of the SS, a member of the Evangelical Church, and sometime around 1941, which was when he joined the SS, his sister-in-law, a woman named Bertha Ebeling, was murdered in one of the euthanasia facilities in Germany. And Kurt Gerstein, after her death, seems to have dedicated himself to working his way through the SS in order to find out exactly what the Nazis were doing in occupied Poland, and then to doing everything that he could to alert the outside world. So Gerstein was an intelligent man. He was a mining engineer. He was also a medic. His qualifications meant that he went through the ranks very quickly and ended up being the SS head of technical disinfection services. And in that role, he's responsible for providing clean drinking water across all of the new occupied territories and for making sure that all of the sewage installations are working. He's also responsible for the shipment of dangerous chemicals like Zyklon B, which obviously is used in extermination camps and most notably Auschwitz. In this role, he was brought to Lublin in occupied Poland, where he was told about the existence of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the three extermination camps on the easternmost side of the country. And while he was there, he was given a tour of Belzec, and he was shown the gassing process from start to finish. He left the world determined. He left that place determined to tell the world about what he had seen. His story is one of the most complicated in the book, and in many ways it's quite tragic because his efforts came to nothing. But he did write a report about Belzec. He had no idea, but this turned out to be one of only 2 eyewitness reports inside that camp, from inside the camp. So it is an extremely valuable historical document. And yeah, like I said, his story is tragic and complicated, but also in ways quite inspiring, because he was dedicated just to telling the truth, because it was the truth, no matter what the cost ended up being to him personally. The fifth chapter is about a man named Alexander Pechersky. So Pechersky was an officer in the Soviet army who ended up imprisoned in the Sobibor extermination camp. Once he was there, he joined forces with a resistance movement that already existed inside the camp. And he helped them to formulate an escape plan that was both practical and workable, but also extremely ambitious. And they launched that escape attempt on the 14th of October, 1943. Excuse me. I won't tell you the full story now of what happened with Pechersky. Suffice to say that it was the single most successful uprising led by Jews that happened during the war. In addition to freeing nearly 300 people, they also managed to assassinate 13 German members of the Nazi Party who were working in the camp that day, including the deputy commandant, who was the senior most member of that group. And their actions resulted in the camp being permanently shut down. Pechersky's story is so extraordinary, it never ceases to amaze me that he is not more well known, that he is not more present in Holocaust education, and I hope that the book will go some way toward correcting that. The sixth chapter is about an intelligence arm of the British Army called the Field Security Sections. So these guys were responsible for going into Germany after the armed forces, where they did everything they could to track down and arrest Nazi war criminals so that these people could be brought to justice after the war was over. I think in some ways this was the hardest chapter of the book to write, just in terms of the logistical challenges, because there's almost nothing that's been written about these guys. And the reason that almost nothing has been written about them is because they paid the most incredible attention to the oath of secrecy that they took when they joined this branch of the intelligence services, right? They were required by the government to keep their work secret. And in almost all instances, they did that right up until the end of their lives. So I came across people whose families had no idea what these men had done during the war. Another thing that I found striking about them was that they were not self-deprecating necessarily, but they seemed to have no sense of the enormity of what they were doing. Just no self-regard at all. As far as they were concerned, this was a job that they were given and it had to be done, and that was it. They had no desire to seek out any kind of fame or recognition or even acknowledgement of their work. If the job was done, then it was done, and that was all that mattered to them. So to tell these stories at all, I had to do a lot of archival work for this chapter just to find stuff that I could write about these guys. And I think in the end I pulled enough together to write the chapter, but there's no doubt in my mind that it's just the tip of the iceberg, that there's still so much more that we need to learn about these people. So, Tale of the Unexpected, number 2. The arts were far more important to all of these resistors than I ever would have predicted when I began writing the book. And I think there's a reason for that, which is that the arts connect us to our own humanity, to issues that are timeless and that are bigger than ourselves, and they force us to take a step back and think about what it means to be human. Over the course of writing the book, and I've sometimes taken criticism for saying this, but I really believe it. If you want to become a better resistor yourself, then an excellent first step is to go to a museum, go to a concert, join a book club, help your local library. All of these things will help the arts, and the arts will help us. Far-right extremism depends on people being so insular that they cannot see beyond themselves, and the arts are the best fix for that. And so, like I said, I found again and again and again, whether I'm talking about the artists in 1920s Germany or the people right up to now who are working with far-right extremists who are trying to leave the movement. To every single one of them, the arts were critical. And I hope that that's something that comes through in the book as well. So, in chapters 7, 8, 9, I began dealing with the legacy of the Holocaust and Nazi Germany as the world began coming to terms with all of this after the war had ended. So, chapter 7 is about a man named Leon Bass. Leon was a black American soldier who, through a long and improbable series of coincidences, ended up being one of the people who liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp. Leon, by his own admission, he self-published an autobiography, was often an angry and frustrated young man, because he felt and wrote about this extensively in his own book. He felt that he had been called upon to defend freedoms that he himself was not afforded as an American at home. And so often he didn't understand why he was fighting or what the purpose of his fight was. And then he ends up going into Buchenwald. As he steps through the gates of Buchenwald and people see his uniform and they realize he's not a German, because of course the Germans didn't give any announcement that we're leaving now, all of these inmates realize that the Americans are here, and so he's rushed by a group of people. While he's in Buchenwald, the inmates show him the horrors of the camp, so they give him a tour. You may know that the thing for which Buchenwald is most infamous are the objects that were there that were made from human skin. I won't say too much about that now. Suffice to say that Leon was shown all of these things, and that his time in the camp had some kind of transformative effect on him. He came back to the US, and for decades after the war, he didn't say anything to anybody about his experiences. He worked as a high school principal, and one day in the 1970s, a guest speaker comes in, and she is a Holocaust survivor. And listening to her story did something to Leon, and he ends up speaking to this woman and becomes convinced that he needs to go out and share what he had seen. And again, through a really extraordinary and improbable series of coincidences, later in his life, Leon ended up being reunited with one of the Jewish prisoners who had rushed him when he first came into Buchenwald. And the two of them formed a partnership, and they spent a lot of their twilight years going around just speaking anywhere that they would be listened to, telling their joint story. And it's really inspiring. Leon unfortunately passed away in 2015, but I was able to track down and find his speaking partner, a guy named Robbie Weissman, who lives in Vancouver. He is in his mid-90s, but was still willing to speak. And I think that's, if I had to pick one of all of the interviews I did, I think that one was maybe the most unique. It was a really, really important conversation. The 8th chapter is about a woman named Emmy Bonhoeffer. So if you recognize the second name Bonhoeffer, that's probably because you're familiar with Dietrich, who is the most famous of a very large family. But the whole family was opposed to Nazism. And Emmy's husband, Klaus, was arrested in the summer of 1944 because he was involved in the attempt to assassinate Hitler. Emmy was an extraordinary woman. After her husband's arrest, she tried to free him by going to the Gestapo headquarters herself. The story of doing that and then her own subsequent escape, as far as I'm aware, is my book's the first time that story's been told in English. But it just, absolutely incredible and deserves to be far better known than it is. But the chapter is more about her role in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. So in the 1960s, in West Germany in particular, society begins to move toward the realization that there's still a lot of war criminals out there. They were never made to answer for their crimes, and so we need to put them on trial. Emmy, watching from a distance, was increasingly dismayed by how poorly the Jewish survivors were being treated at this trial. Right, they're being flown in from around the world, being asked to testify in German to a court that's speaking exclusively German, often with the people who are accused of having tormented them just a few feet away from them. There's no sense at all that they needed any kind of support to get through this ordeal. And so Emmy, very quietly, out of the public eye, without wanting any kind of recognition for what she was doing, set up a support network for these survivors. And I think today it's the kind of thing that we might just take for granted, that you might think, well, yeah, of course there would be a support network. But back then there wasn't. And, like I said, she was not seeking acknowledgement or recognition for what she had done. But she triggered a movement. And every time a new trial popped up somewhere in Germany, these support networks would grow out of the work that she had done. And I think just her willingness to connect with victims and to hear their story and to make sure that their stories were being properly platformed and listened to is something that's very inspiring for today. The 9th chapter is about a woman named Gita Sereni. So Sereni was an Austrian-British journalist, and she was very deeply motivated by a desire to understand why Nazi war criminals had become the criminals that they became. She wanted to know how you could go from being an ordinary person before the war to being somebody who committed mass murder during the war. She went on a very long search trying to find someone that she could interview. And whenever she went to trials, more often than not, she was disappointed. She felt that the people weren't opening up, they weren't saying anything. She wanted also to find someone who appeared to be intelligent and capable of self-criticism and who may be willing to sit down and speak with her. In the late 1960s, she gets a phone call from a public prosecutor in Germany who is aware of her work, and he says to her, "I think that we found your guy." And that guy was a man named Franz Stangl. Stangl had been the commandant of Treblinka. Before that, he'd been the commandant of Sobibor, and before that, he'd worked on the euthanasia program in Germany. So over the course of his career, he would have overseen over 1 million murders quite easily. And he was found and arrested in Brazil in 1967 and then extradited to Germany, where he faced trial. Like I said, this public prosecutor knew what Gita was looking for, and he thought that Stangl was the man. So Sereni came over, she orchestrated a meeting with him, and she managed to get him to agree to sit down for 70 hours of interviews with her, where she would just ask him about his life, right? So she makes very clear in the interview process, I'm not asking you about the rights and wrongs of what you did, that's for the court. I want to know who you are. And so she gets this life story from him, and in the end, she manages to extract something from him which the court never did, right? Because in court, he follows the same line they all followed, which is that I was just following my orders. I was just doing what I was told to do. Through this process of interviewing, Gita managed to get a confession of guilt from him, which, like I said, something the court had not managed to do. And 19 hours after he'd given her that confession, he died of a heart attack in his cell. It's a really remarkable story. She wrote a book off the back of it called Into That Darkness, which if you haven't read it, go buy it today. You're in a lovely bookstore. I'm sure they have it here. And it's really an incredible piece of work. So the 10th chapter is about the movie Shoah. And I didn't, in the book, kind of pit Sereni and Shoah against each other. But I did put them next to each other deliberately because Claude Lanzmann, the director of Shoah, pursues a completely different line of reasoning from Gita Sereni, right? He's doing something similar, which is going around interviewing people about their experiences of the Holocaust. But he explicitly states that it is obscene. Obscene is the word that he uses. It is obscene to try and understand why these people did what they did. The only thing that we should be doing is documenting it. And so he goes out with this explicit mission to understand nothing, right? He just wants to get the truth of what happened on camera. And so he interviews survivors, he interviews bystanders. But for the purposes of my book, the interviews in which I was most interested were his interviews with perpetrators. And so right from the beginning, I have a question, which is, how do you get a perpetrator to sit down for an interview, especially if that perpetrator thinks, I'm not here to be understood? And the answer to that question is that you lie, you engage in subterfuge, you engage in all sorts of tricks. Anything that you can do to fool this person into getting their story on camera, you can do it. And so they did, Landsman and his team. They invented fake identities, they used hidden cameras, they filmed people without their knowledge or their consent, all in the name of preserving these stories, no matter the cost. I was able to interview one of the research assistants who had worked with Landsman from the beginning of the movie, and some of the things that they did to get those stories, some of the situations that they put themselves into, just absolutely unbelievable. But it's an incredible document. And again, if you haven't seen Shoah, definitely add it to your watch list, because it's, for me, certainly the best movie about the Holocaust that's ever been made, but also one of the best movies that's ever been made, period. The 11th chapter is about a piece of legal history in the United States. So the so-called Holtzman Amendment. So in the late 70s and 80s, it became increasingly clear that thousands, literally thousands, of former Nazis had fled Europe after the war and made new homes for themselves in the United States. Most of these guys were doing everything they could to live under the radar and to renounce their former lives. They did not want to be known for who they were. But tracking immigration documents, it became possible to identify many of them. I spoke with Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, who led the charge to get all of these people extradited and out of the country, and also with Ralph Blumenthal, who is a New York Times journalist. And Ralph spent a lot of his career trying to uncover these people. And probably the most important of the guys that he uncovered was a man named Valerian Trifa. Trifa was extraordinary for a lot of reasons. The main one being that where most of these guys sought to live in anonymity, Trifa became a public figure in the United States, and happily became a public figure. He was an archbishop in the Romanian Orthodox Church. He was also a major war criminal who had been responsible for one of the worst pogroms of the Second World War, but it didn't stop him from delivering the prayer at the opening address of the United States Senate in 1955. So just amazing that he'd been able to live his life undisturbed here for so long. So yeah, in the penultimate chapter, I try and tell the story of how he was tracked down and brought to justice. The final chapter of the book, the 12th chapter, is about people who call themselves formers. So formers are people who used to belong to white supremacist or other far-right extremist movements in the United States and have since left and are trying to get others to leave as well. I think in some regards this was the most challenging of the chapters that I wrote, certainly the hardest to find someone that I could interview. I came to realize as I was writing the book, there is something of a cottage industry of tell-all books written by formers. And obviously, I applaud their journey and their efforts to get away from the movements to which they once belonged. But nevertheless, a lot of these books strike me as being deeply problematic. If you have ever seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, a lot of the books have the same kind of vibe, right? So The Wolf of Wall Street is about the real-life banker Jordan Belfort, who through a series of all sorts of financial crimes became incredibly rich and then lost everything, and then kind of sells his story afterwards. And just as in that movie, It kind of starts out seemingly as this warning against greed and avarice, but accidentally almost ends up glamorizing Jordan Belfort and the life of excess that he lived. It's the same kind of thing with the former's books, right? That oftentimes the message seems to be, yes, I was terribly bad, and I know I was terribly bad. Now let me tell you just how bad I was, right? And the book becomes kind of voyeuristic, and all of the victims who are in the book become these kind of silent tools of self-discovery who only exist for the benefit of the former who is telling their story. So I read a lot of these things and thought, no, this isn't quite right, this isn't quite right. And then eventually I came across a man named Arno Michaelis. Arno had been a recruiter for one of the biggest white supremacist movements in the United States in the 1980s. He left decades ago and founded a non-profit organization called Life After Hate, which tries to get people out of the movements. The reason that I thought that Arno was the right person to ask is because unlike so many of the others, he often involves his victims in his work, or people at least who were victims of this movement. So he has co-authored books, he has co-directed movies, and I respected that desire to have the other side of the story told. The interview that I did with him was the longest, just in terms of the number of hours that we spent speaking to each other. I think challenging because there were lots of things in his past that needed to be addressed. But I think in the end it became a useful insight into how these movements are operating right now, what it is that pulls people into them, and why it can be so terribly hard for people to leave them. So, Tale of the Unexpected number 3. I finished the manuscript for this book while I was on parental leave. My wife was pregnant through most of 2024, sorry, and the manuscript was due in on January 16th, 2025. My first child, my son, was due to be born on December 16th, 2025. And so I made a solemn agreement with my unborn son. You arrived December 16th and not one day earlier, and I will have this manuscript done. I will have it finished 1 full month early, then I can put it to one side and we can forget about it. Of course, my son broke that agreement. He arrived a week early, and so the completion of the manuscript was scattered across those first few weeks. My wife has some wonderful photographs of me on the sofa with just leaves of paper scattered all around the floor and a 3-week-old baby sleeping on my lap. I say that I learned a lot while I was writing Resisting Nazism. I learned a lot about history. I think mostly, actually, I learned how to multitask. I learned the true meaning of multitasking that month. Okay, so takeaways for today. Obviously, it's complicated. When I began writing the book, which was in summer 22, the world was a very different place. And really my aspiration for it was that it would be a nice complement to the Ninth Candles programs and maybe something teachers could use when they were in the classroom. And then as I was doing the research and the interviews, the kind of political landscape of the world began to shift. To go back to Detlef Peukert, the historian I was speaking about right at the beginning, he said in his book with the graph outlining all of the different types of resistance, when he was writing about what we should take away from reflecting on this history, he said that actually it was all quite simple. We need to have a reverence for life. We need to be able to find pleasure in diversity and in difference. We need to be able to respect what is alien. We need to be able to tolerate what is unpalatable. We need to be skeptical about the feasibility and the desirability of any grand scheme to create some kind of new order. We need to be open toward others, and we need to be willing to learn from those with whom we disagree. And I love those sentiments. I think they're so relevant for right now. My best hope for the book is that through all of the examples of these untold stories, that those stories will exemplify those values and hopefully give us some ideas for how we might be able to move forward today. So thanks again to the lovely team at the LA Holocaust Museum. Whatever time we've got left, I'll be happy to take questions, and otherwise, thanks again, everyone, so much for coming.
Anti-Semitism, Jewish hate, people, we teach it or we don't teach it. Does it make any difference when we see what's happening today? What do you think?
For me, I think especially after writing the book, in some senses, I do my best not to ask myself that question. If we get too lost in the moment, then there's a risk of losing sight of the mission. Kurt Gerstein, in the book, I mentioned a letter that he wrote to his father, in which he explains or tries to explain some of the crazy things that he's been doing. And he says to his father something along the lines of, it's in the nature of those with a spark of daring in them to risk all that they have, even their substance, for the sake of an uncertain gain. And I think, when I do this work, when you do the docent work, I think the gains are uncertain. The gains are uncertain, but it has to be worth the risk. And if you look at Kurt's story, for example, when he did what he did and then wrote that report, he had no idea that he was the only German eyewitness who was going to say anything about that camp. No idea at all. So he had absolutely no sense when he wrote that report that it was going to go on and become such a valuable document. He committed himself to writing it for higher reasons, right? Which is that it is the right thing to do. And so, we go on educating, we go on doing what we're doing because it's the right thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pivot, doesn't mean that we shouldn't adapt and experiment and be trying new things all the time to get our message across. But for me, it's about keeping sight of that higher mission and trying to, rest in the faith that it is the right thing to do. So we haven't yet made the dent that we would like to make in the national picture. But certainly when we go visit individual schools, we know for sure that we've made a difference in smaller communities. And for me, even though that work is slow and painstaking, that makes it worth it. If I'm satisfied that we've made a difference to one high school, especially if that high school is in a place where Holocaust education is really urgently needed, right? I'm talking like rural public schools in the middle of Montana, for example, where there is no Jewish community and there is no Holocaust museum for hundreds of square miles. That's rewarding, but it takes patience. I want to address some of the other parts of what you said. So when we're talking to schools about the necessity of Holocaust education, obviously, like I said, the tagline is ending anti-Semitism by sharing knowledge. That's because for us, anti-Semitism is always born of ignorance. Right? The reason that you can tell it's born from ignorance is because it's an ideology that contradicts itself. And that's what we try to show to the kids, right? In the anti-Semitic imagination, Jews are, for example, both very rich and very poor. They are in control of society, but they're also tearing it apart, right? All of these things cannot be true simultaneously. And if you hold it up to them like that, and try to lower the temperature a bit, and talk about it that way rather than in terms of hate, and you just allow them to see for themselves that this ideology cannot hold up, it almost kind of, you can see it dissolving in their hands almost. So when we are trying to get schools on board with our programs, that's how we'll tell them that we're doing it, is to try and expose the contradictory nature of anti-Semitism. But we'll also tell them that in order to do that, our programs put forward critical thinking, right? And we're going to teach your kids how to tell the difference between the truth and an opinion. We're going to tell them how to find reliable sources on the internet, and we're going to tell them how to spot sources that are unreliable, right? And schools like that because it's these are bigger skill sets that they're all trying to give to their kids. So I don't know if that's answered your question or not, but for me, Holocaust Ed certainly has a place in all schools. It serves purposes like as well as addressing anti-Semitism and as well as addressing the historical event. It has other skills that it can give to students. That's why it's so important that they study it, right? We will say to schools, it's the mother of all subjects. If you want to know something about what it means to be human, you need to study the Holocaust. If you want to know something about what it means to be human, you have to study this subject. If you want to improve your skills in history and sociology and philosophy and psychology, this is a subject that can tick all of those boxes simultaneously. And so, yeah, through that, we're able to open doors that I think often remain closed otherwise. But yeah, I'm not going to stand here and say it's easy. It's not. It's a terrible struggle. But it's like I said at the beginning, I kind of cling on to the belief that it's worth it, that there are higher goals that I'm aiming towards, and the ebb and flow of the landscape right now, it can change. It can change on a dime, and yeah, it's important not to lose sight of that.
So, as a thought leader, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about the righteousness of the hate and how this book and your thoughts on kind of countering that ever-present drumbeat, how we can kind of turn back that tide, using a lot of these great stories,
It seems to me, and has done for a while now, like since I started Ninth Candle, which was 2020, that anti-Semitism is a useful tool for going viral, right? It's a tool of virality, and that is because we live in an age that prioritizes shock, taboo, anything that is likely to generate outrage. And I think off the back of that's one of the reasons that anti-Semitism has become so prevalent on social media, on both the right and the left end of the spectrum. The messaging at either end of those spectrums might be slightly different, but the goal's the same, right? Which is to get the biggest possible reaction that I can, and to send this message as far as possible. And anti-Semitism is used as a tool for that. I think certainly in terms of us and like our programs and what we do, we will try and get the students to think about why that is, why anti-Semitism and not another form of hatred. And we will try and get them to think about it critically alongside other conspiracy theories. And so we'll help them to see that this conspiracy theory, for example, has a longevity that others don't, right? It is thousands of years old. More than that, it also has a breadth that other conspiracy theories don't, right? Conspiracy theories normally deal with one particular thing that, one particular issue about why society is the way that it is. Anti-Semitism is much broader than that. It's claiming to explain all of these people who are in charge of everything, right? And why the whole of society is shaped in this one particular way. So it's got this vintage, which I think in the eyes of the people who are spreading it gives it maybe a credibility or a legitimacy that other conspiracy theories don't have. And then it also has this enormous broad brush utility. You can use it to explain anything you want, which again helps us to understand why it's there on the left and on the right. So it's certainly on our programs, we'll try and get students to think about it in that way, that kind of analytical way. So that's what I mean when I say, like, we set out to try and lower the temperature and encourage them to ask the difficult questions and to lean into those difficult discussions so that we can try and show them this conspiracy theory for what it is. In terms of these stories and how it helps counters it, or how they help counter it. I mean, this is the reason that I began doing it why I began searching out these stories in the first place, right? So Pechersky, the guy I mentioned who led the uprising in the Sobibor extermination camp, we used to do a program called Alexander Pechersky and Why You've Never Heard of Him. And every time I would go to the kids and say, I took a gamble today when I called this lesson Alexander Pechersky and Why You've Never Heard of Him. Why do you think I'm so confident that you've never heard of him? I haven't met you. I don't know which books you have and haven't read. And then we kind of go into that discussion. Well, maybe Pechersky as this soldier, as this man who defeated a whole bunch of Nazis, as this man who led an escape and uprising out of an extermination camp. Maybe there's something about his story that doesn't fit the narrative that's in your mind without you even realizing it when you're thinking about Jews and what Jewish people are. And then you see them have this light bulb moment. You go, oh yeah, there isn't really space in the conversation for a Jew who defied the Nazis. There isn't really a space in the conversation for a Jew who is a really brave, strong soldier, because that's not what I think of when I think of the Holocaust. So yeah, they are useful tools. And I think, for me, and this is something that came up in the 12th chapter as well, the goal is always to try and let them see it for themselves, right? I put the pieces of the puzzle in front of them on the table, but I want them to be the ones to put it together. If I just went there and lectured them and said, you guys are wrong, and when you go on social media and you say these horrible things, you're spreading really hurtful stuff, doesn't work. You have to give them the opportunity to work like an historian and say, okay, let's investigate. And then give them the tools they need to investigate and allow them to reach the conclusion themselves. And then that's when they realize, like, oh, and then they feel like they own it. And then you see them turn away. And that's what we're aiming for.